February 22nd, 1943, Munich, Germany, Stadelheim Prison. Sophie Scholl is 21 years old. In 3 hours, she will be dead. She sits in her cell writing a final letter. Outside, Nazi Germany is at the height of its power. The Wehrmacht occupies most of Europe. Millions serve the regime without question. Resistance seems futile, but Sophie chose to resist anyway. She and 4 friends printed 6 leaflets calling for Germans to overthrow Hitler. They distributed them in secret across Munich and other cities. They knew the penalty for this was death. They did it anyway. Now Sophie waits for the guillotine. Her brother Hans waits in the next cell. Their friend Christoph waits in another. All 3 will be executed today, beheaded, for printing words on paper. This is the story of the White Rose. Not a story of armed rebellion or dramatic escapes. A story of 5 ordinary students who saw evil and could not stay silent. Who chose certain death over comfortable complicity. A story the Nazis tried to erase. A story that survived anyway. Sophie Scholl was born in 1921 in a small German town. Normal family, normal childhood. Her father owned a business. Her mother raised 6 children. When Hitler came to power in 1933, Sophie was 12. Like millions of German children, she joined the Hitler Youth. She believed the propaganda. She wore the uniform. She attended the rallies. She was, by all accounts, an enthusiastic member, a good German girl. But her father Robert had doubts. He spoke against the Nazis at home, quietly, carefully. He told his children to think for themselves, to question what they were told. Sophie began to notice things: the increasing restrictions on Jews, the arrests of neighbors who spoke too freely, the fear in people's eyes. By 16, she was questioning the regime. By 18, she wanted nothing to do with it. In 1942, Sophie enrolled at the University of Munich to study biology and philosophy. Her brother Hans was already there, studying medicine. Hans had his own journey away from the Nazis. He served in the Wehrmacht as a medic. He saw the Eastern Front. He saw what German soldiers did to civilians in Poland and Russia. He saw the mass graves, the burned villages, the casual brutality. He came back changed, haunted, unable to pretend anymore that this was a noble cause. At the university, Hans met other students who felt the same way. Alexander Schmerel, also a medical student. Christoph Probst, a friend from childhood. Willy Graf, quiet and serious. And Professor Kurt Huber, who taught philosophy and spoke carefully coded criticisms of the regime in his lectures. These were not radicals, not communists or revolutionaries. They were ordinary students from ordinary families. They went to classes. They studied for exams. They dated and drank beer and lived normal lives. But they could not ignore what was happening around them. In June 1942, Hans and Alexander decided to do something. Not an armed uprising, not sabotage or violence. Something simpler and more dangerous. They would tell the truth. They wrote a leaflet, 4 pages, typed on a manual typewriter, titled, "Leaflets of the White Rose." The text was careful, philosophical. It quoted Goethe and Schiller, German cultural heroes the Nazis could not easily dismiss. It spoke of moral responsibility, of conscience, of the duty to resist tyranny. It did not mention Jews directly. It did not detail Nazi crimes explicitly. It was written to speak to educated Germans who already knew what was happening, but needed permission to acknowledge it. The final paragraph was a call to action. "We will not be silent. We are your bad conscience. The White Rose will not leave you in peace." They printed 100 copies using a hand-operated duplicating machine. They bought stamps. They addressed envelopes to random names from the Munich phone book. Then they mailed them and waited to be arrested. Nothing happened. The Gestapo received reports of the leaflets. They investigated. They found nothing. The leaflets had been mailed from different post boxes across the city. There were no fingerprints, No obvious clues. The students realized they had gotten away with it. So they did it again. Leaflet 2, then 3, then 4. Each one bolder than the last. Each one printed in larger quantities. Each one distributed more widely. By the fourth leaflet, they were mailing copies to other cities: Stuttgart, Vienna, Salzburg. Copies appeared in cafes and phone booths, on university bulletin boards, in church pews. The Gestapo knew someone was operating in Munich. They assigned more investigators. They watched the universities. They monitored typewriter sales and paper purchases. But they could not find the source. Sophie was not involved at first. Hans kept the white rose secret from her. He wanted to protect her. She was his little sister. He did not want to put her in danger. But Sophie figured it out. She found leaflets in Hans's room. She confronted him. Hans tried to deny it. Then he tried to convince her to stay out of it. "Too dangerous," he said. "You have your whole life ahead of you." Sophie's response was simple. "If you're doing this, I'm doing this." She joined the group in fall 1942. Now there were 6 core members: Hans, Sophie, Alexander, Christoph, Willy, and Professor Huber. They were careful. They never met all together. They used code words. They stored the duplicating machine in different locations. They burned drafts and cleaned up carefully after each printing session. But they were also ambitious. Leaflet 5 went to thousands of recipients. They began writing graffiti on university walls at night. "Down with Hitler! Freedom! Hitler the mass murderer!" They knew they were pushing their luck. They knew the Gestapo was getting closer, but they could not stop. Not while the war continued. Not while the death camps operated. Not while Germans pretended not to know what was being done in their name. In January 1943, they prepared the 6th leaflet. This one was different, angrier, more direct. It spoke openly of the murder of Polish Jews. It called the regime criminal. It urged Germans to sabotage the war effort, to resist, to rebel. Professor Huber helped write it. He was 50 years old with a wife and 2 children. He knew what he was risking. He did it anyway. They printed 1,500 copies of the 6th leaflet, and then they made a fatal mistake. February 18, 1943, Thursday morning. The University of Munich. Classes are in session. The main atrium is quiet. Most students are in lectures. Hans and Sophie arrive carrying a suitcase. Inside are the remaining copies of the 6th leaflet, about 100 sheets. Their plan is simple. Leave stacks of leaflets around the university, in hallways, on windowsills, where students will find them between classes. They work quickly. Hans places stacks near lecture hall doors. Sophie leaves them on railings and benches. Within minutes, they have distributed most of the leaflets. The suitcase is nearly empty. They should leave now. Walk away. Come back another day for the rest. But Sophie looks at the remaining leaflets, about 80 sheets. She does not want to waste them. She walks to the atrium balcony on the 3rd floor. Below, the marble floor is empty. Classes will let out in 10 minutes. Students will flood the atrium. If she drops the leaflets now, they will flutter down like snow. Students will see them, pick them up, read them. It will be perfect. Hans sees what she is planning. He tries to stop her. "Too risky, we should go." But Sophie is already lifting the leaflets. She tosses them over the railing. They float down. White papers drifting through the air. Beautiful, defiant. And Jakob Schmidt, the university janitor and Nazi party member, sees everything. He runs toward them, screaming, demanding they stop. Hans and Sophie run for the exit, but Schmidt blocks their path. He grabs Sophie's arm. Other staff arrive. The doors are locked. Within minutes, the Gestapo is called. Hans and Sophie are arrested. The remaining leaflets are confiscated. 4 days later, they are dead. The interrogation begins immediately. Gestapo headquarters, separate rooms for Hans and Sophie. The lead investigator is Robert Moore. He is good at his job, patient, methodical. He does not use torture. He does not need to. He tells Sophie the truth. Your brother has confessed everything. He named all the others. You are already condemned. Your only hope is to cooperate and perhaps receive prison instead of death. It is a lie. Hans has confessed nothing. Sophie does not believe Moore anyway. She constructs a story. The leaflets were not theirs. They found them. They were going to turn them in. This is all a misunderstanding. Moore does not believe her, but he has no proof. Without a confession or witnesses, he cannot prove they created the leaflets. He can charge them with possession and distribution, which carries a prison sentence, but not death. Then the Gestapo searches Hans and Sophie's rooms. They find drafts, handwritten notes in Hans's handwriting, the duplicating machine hidden in Alexander's studio. The evidence is overwhelming. Sophie changes her story. Yes, we made the leaflets. Yes, we distributed them. But we worked alone. No one else was involved. She is protecting the others, especially Christoph, who has a wife and 3 young children. Hans tells the same story. We did everything, alone, no accomplices. The Gestapo does not believe them. They know there were others. They find a draft in Christoph's handwriting in Hans's room. The Gestapo does not believe them. They know there were others. They find a draft in Christoph's handwriting in Hans's room. Christoph is arrested on February 20th. Willie and Alexander go into hiding but will be caught later. The Nazis want a quick trial. An example. They charge Hans, Sophie, and Christoph with treason and defeatism. The trial is scheduled for February 22nd, 4 days after the arrest. There is no real defense. The evidence is clear. The accused do not deny what they did. The trial is held before the People's Court, a Nazi show trial system. The judge is Roland Freisler, infamous for his screaming denunciations of defendants. Freisler travels from Berlin specifically for this trial. He wants to personally condemn these traitors. The trial begins at 10 in the morning. Hans, Sophie, and Christoph are brought into the courtroom in handcuffs. Their parents are allowed to attend. Robert and Magdalena Scholl sit in the gallery, watching their children on trial for their lives. Freisler reads the charges: treason, aiding the enemy, defeatism, undermining military morale. The punishment for each is death. The defendants are allowed to speak. Hans stands first. He does not apologize. He does not beg for mercy. He says simply, "What we wrote and said is what many people think. They just do not dare to say it." Freisler screams at him, calls him a traitor, demands to know how he could betray the fatherland while German soldiers die at the front. Hans responds calmly, "I know the war is lost. The death of German soldiers is meaningless. The regime has already destroyed Germany." The courtroom gasps. To say the war is lost is treason even by itself. Freisler turns purple with rage. He screams that Hans will die screaming for the Führer. Hans remains calm. "You will be standing where I am standing soon." It is a prophecy. Freisler will die in 1945 during an Allied bombing raid. But that is still 2 years away. Sophie speaks next. She is small, quiet, composed. She does not raise her voice. "Somebody had to make a start. What we wrote and said is believed by many others. They just do not dare express themselves as we did." Freisler mocks her. A silly girl playing at politics, misled by her brother. Sophie's response is steady. "I do not consider what I did to be wrong. I would do it again." Christoph speaks last. He has 3 children under 5 years old. His wife is expecting a 4th child. He does not beg for his life. He says only, "I wanted Germans to know the truth. That is not treason. That is patriotism." The trial lasts less than 4 hours. Freisler delivers the verdict: guilty on all counts. Sentence: death by beheading. to be carried out today. No appeals, no delays, immediate execution. The condemned are taken back to Stadelheim prison. Their parents are allowed a brief visit. Robert Scholl tries to see his children. The guards refuse. He shouts through the prison, "There is another justice. They will go down in history." Magdalena Scholl is allowed 5 minutes with each child. She finds Sophie calm, almost at peace. Sophie tells her mother, "It is such a splendid sunny day and I have to go. But how many have to die on the battlefield in these days? How many young, promising lives? What does my death matter if by our acts thousands are warned and alerted?" She asks her mother to remember her to friends. She says she has no regrets. Magdalena later says Sophie walked to her execution as if she were going to a party. 5 o'clock in the afternoon. The execution chamber at Stadelheim prison. Christoph Probst goes first. He converted to Catholicism in the prison that morning and received last rites. He is calm. He is led to the guillotine and executed. Hans is next. He shouts as he is brought to the blade, "Long live freedom!" The executioner brings the blade down. Silence. Sophie is last. She walks steadily. The executioner will later say she showed no fear. She placed her head on the block herself. Her last recorded words, spoken to the guards, "The sun still shines." The blade falls. Sophie Scholl is dead at 21. All 3 executions take less than 10 minutes. The bodies are taken to the Munich cemetery and buried in unmarked graves. The Nazis believe they have crushed the White Rose. They are wrong. The remaining members of the White Rose are arrested over the following months. Alexander Schmorell is caught trying to flee to Switzerland. Willy Graf is betrayed by an informant. Professor Huber is identified from handwriting analysis. All 3 are tried and executed. Alexander and Willy die by guillotine in October 1943. Professor Huber dies in July 1943. Before his execution, Alexander Schmorell is asked if he regrets his actions. He responds, "I am convinced I did the best thing I could have done for my nation. I do not regret my conduct and will bear the consequences." His final words before the blade falls, "I die for Christ." Willy Graf is tortured for months before his execution. The Gestapo wants names of other resistance members. He gives them nothing. Even under torture, he protects his friends. Professor Huber writes a final statement. "I demand the return of personal freedom, the most precious treasure of the German people, which has been stolen from us in the most miserable way. I acted as a German, as a patriot who desired the best for his people." The Nazis execute dozens of others connected to the White Rose. Students who knew about the leaflets and said nothing. Friends who provided money or materials. People who simply agreed with the ideas. The regime wants to erase the White Rose completely, to terrify anyone else who might resist. But they cannot destroy the ideas. The 6th leaflet survives. Copies were smuggled out of Germany. One reaches the Allies. The British Royal Air Force reprints it. In summer 1943, Allied planes drop millions of copies over Germany. The leaflet the Nazis killed 6 people to suppress is now raining from the sky across the Reich. German civilians pick up the leaflets, read them. Many are shocked to learn that their fellow Germans wrote these words, that students their children's age chose death to speak truth. The White Rose becomes a symbol, not of successful resistance, they changed nothing militarily, but of moral courage, of the possibility of dissent even in totalitarian darkness. After the war, Germany struggles with its Nazi past. Many Germans claim they did not know about the camps, that they were just following orders, that there was nothing they could do. The White Rose is proof that this is a lie. 5 students knew what was happening. They chose to act. They knew they would die. They did it anyway. If 5 students could resist, anyone could have. Sophie Scholl becomes the face of German resistance. Her calm courage, her moral clarity, her final words, "The sun still shines." She becomes what Germans wish they had been, a symbol of the Germany that could have been if more people had chosen courage over fear. But the reality is more complicated and more important than the myth. Sophie was not a saint. She struggled with doubt. She was terrified of dying. She was 21 years old and wanted to live. She resisted anyway. Hans was not a fearless hero. He hesitated for months before printing the first leaflet. He was sick with fear before each distribution. He resisted anyway. These were not extraordinary people. They were ordinary students who made an extraordinary choice. That is the real lesson of the White Rose. Resistance is not the domain of saints and heroes. It is a choice available to anyone. Sophie and Hans were biology students. Alexander was studying medicine. Christoph was a husband and father. Willie was quiet and unremarkable. Professor Huber was a middle-aged academic. None of them were natural revolutionaries. None of them wanted to die. But they saw evil and could not look away. They saw lies and could not stay silent. They saw their nation committing crimes and could not pretend they did not know. So they printed words on paper. They told the truth. They called for resistance. And for that, the regime killed them. But the regime could not kill the idea that resistance was possible, that ordinary people could choose conscience over compliance, that even certain death could not silence truth. The White Rose did not defeat the Nazis. The Allies did that. The White Rose did not save lives. They saved something more fragile and more important. They saved the possibility of German redemption. They proved that not all Germans were Nazis, that some chose differently, that moral courage existed even in the darkest time. For post-war Germany, struggling with collective guilt, the White Rose offered hope. Not absolution, most Germans did not resist, but hope that the nation could produce people like Sophie and Hans, that German culture, despite everything, still contained the seeds of decency. Today, the University of Munich has a memorial to the White Rose. The atrium where Sophie dropped the leaflets is named after her. Students walk past a bronze plaque marking where she stood. Schools across Germany are named after White Rose members. Stamps and coins bear their images. Their story is taught in history classes. But this commemoration can become too comfortable. It can transform Sophie and Hans from real people who made difficult choices into safe symbols of past resistance. The danger is forgetting that they were ordinary, that they were scared, that they hesitated, that they were not certain their actions would matter. They chose to act anyway. That is the lesson that transcends Nazi Germany, that speaks to every time and place where injustice exists and resistance seems futile. The White Rose asks each of us, what would you do? When you see evil, do you speak? When speaking means death, do you stay silent? Most people choose silence. That is human. That is understandable. That is what Sophie and Hans almost chose. But they did not. And because they did not, we know their names. We remember their choice. We carry their example forward. Not because they won, they lost everything. Their lives, their futures, their families. But they proved something essential, that one does not resist to win. One resists because it is right, because silence is complicity, because the choice to speak, even when futile, is the choice to remain human. Sophie Scholl's last words were not a grand speech or political manifesto. They were simple. The sun still shines. In the darkness of Nazi Germany, facing death in 3 hours, she saw light. Not metaphorical light, the actual sun, shining through her cell window on a February afternoon. She was about to die for printing leaflets. Her brother would die. Her friends would die. The regime she opposed would continue for 2 more years. Nothing she did would stop the war or save the victims. But the sun still shone. Beauty and truth still existed. She had chosen rightly. She could die at peace. That is the legacy of the White Rose. Not military victory or political success, but the proof that even in absolute darkness, resistance is possible. That truth matters even when it costs everything. That ordinary people can make choices that echo through history. Sophie Scholl was 21, Hans was 24, Christoph was 23, Alexander was 25, Willie was 25, Professor Huber was 49. 6 people, 6 lives, 6 executions. But the idea they died for survived. The truth they spoke outlasted the regime that killed them. Their names are remembered while their executioners are forgotten. They did not die to be remembered. They died because they could not do otherwise and remain themselves. Because silence would have destroyed them more surely than the guillotine. We remember the white rose not to celebrate death, but to honor the choice to resist. To acknowledge that such choices exist. To admit that we, in their position, might not have their courage. And to commit, if we ever face such a choice, to remember their example. To know that resistance is possible, that truth matters, that ordinary people can do extraordinary things, that the sun still shines.